Well, thank you for joining us today, Mindy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about the elephant on the table there. You've got a new book out.
I do.
Let's get into it. How did this come about? And moreover, what was the experience that led to it?
Well, it's Dying to Meet Them, One Woman's Incredible Journey from NDE to UAP. And so this really kind of chronicles my journey going from having a near-death experience and into how I got involved with investigating UFOs. And so in the book, it starts off talking about what led up to the near-death experience. I was an ICU nurse by trade before this, and my husband was a Southern Baptist minister. And so, we were, your typical true blue Americans. We traveled all over the state of Oklahoma to preach the gospel. Had lived out in eastern Oklahoma for a while. And whenever my father-in-law started getting ill, we moved up to northern Oklahoma to his farm. And this was a huge 300-acre wheat farm. At one point, it was a 3,000-acre wheat farm. But he was in his 70s and was having some health concerns and asked us to come out and kind of help him out there. So we had moved out there, and our kids were very young. They were 5 and 7 at the time. And after living there for a few months, I was having some health problems. And one day, the kids and John, my husband, had gone off to work. My husband at the time was working at the local school. And so he drove the school bus and took the kids with him. And they were gone, and I was home by myself. And it was actually election day, November 8th of 2016, that this all transpired. And of course, we were excited to go vote. And I was looking at exit polls. And I'd come and sat on the couch in the afternoon waiting for them to get home. And that's when I heard a large gunshot sound go off in my head. And instantly, being a nurse, I'm trying to assess what's going on here. And my first instinct was that maybe I'd been shot. There had been some coyote hunters around, out in the fields, searching for coyotes. And so I thought maybe one of them had shot through the wall of the house and had shot me in the head. So I start trying to assess, I'm trying to, and it's kind of gross. I was kind of see if I could feel blood running down the back of my neck or anything. And I couldn't. And so that's when I realized this has got to be some type of brain aneurysm. And at that realization, I freaked. I mean, I really did. I was sitting on the couch with the front door open, waiting for my kids to come in, waiting for my husband to come in any minute. And I thought, oh God, they're going to find me dead. And so instantly I'm praying, God, please don't let my kids find my body. I just was thinking of them running in and giving me hugs and kisses and telling me about their day. And, that to think that you're going to end up being the worst thing that's ever happened to them, it's soul crushing as a parent. So I started just really getting deep into prayer. And as I felt this electrical avalanche is the best I can describe it, that went from my head down to my feet. And it was terribly painful. And at that, I kind of started losing consciousness. I could feel my head kind of dipping and everything. And I thought, oh God, I'm dying. This is it. And I continued to pray for my kids. And I was just in such deep, deep sorrow. And the next thing I know, I stop and I look around. And I was just in complete darkness. And I thought, well, what's this?
All right.
And
let me ask you here, how long in duration do you think that this was from this moment to the darkness?
no more than a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. And it seems extremely drawn out because I remember every moment of it. It's almost like time slows down, because so much is happening and your brain's firing in so many ways. So whenever I got to the darkness, my first instinct was to stick my hand out in front of my face. And that's what you see on the cover of the book. And so I was trying to see if I could see my hand. And when I couldn't, my next instinct was to try to clap my hands.
Yeah.
And so whenever I tried to do that, that's when I realized I'm dead. I'm definitely dead. I had no form. I had no hands. I was just kind of this consciousness floating out there in the darkness at that point. So instantly I'm turning to my Christian beliefs. I'm thinking, well, what's next? My judgment. And so I'm waiting for like a tunnel of light to appear and my grandma to show up, and Jesus to greet me, and I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I'm kind of freaking out and trying to prepare myself for, either going to heaven or hell. And I'm praying. I'm praying, Jesus, be my righteousness. I can't get in without you. And I wait, and there was nothing. And it just seemed like an eternity being out there by myself for so long. In reality, it was probably minutes, but over there, it seemed like forever because I was so distraught. I didn't know
Okay.
where I was. I was getting no answer, but I could feel God all around me. I could feel just this immense force of creation, and everything that had ever existed was surrounding me, but I was cut off from it. It was almost, I say in the book, it's almost like I was in an invisible box. And that was hard to take because I was separate. I had just lost my husband. I had just lost my kids. I'm never going to see them again. And now I'm separate from everything in creation. I'm separate from my God. I can feel him around me and I can't be part of it. And I didn't understand. And so I prayed. I prayed more and I questioned God. Why am I not good enough? I've traveled around. I've preached your gospel. I've loved you my entire life. I've tried to be a good person and live by your rules, and I don't understand. And it came to me that I had to learn to love myself. It wasn't like a life review for me. You hear some people, they think of instances in their life.
Right.
Me, it was more of an overall assessment of myself. And I found that I wasn't lacking in loving other people, was lacking in loving myself enough to think that I was worthy to go to heaven. And as soon as I did that, a presence showed up over my left shoulder. And he wasn't human. He wasn't God, he wasn't anyone that I knew. But he was definitely male. And he showed up and it was almost like a hesitant kindness. And he said, "You're not going to be here forever." And instantly I was like, okay, someone's here. I'm not here forever. This is good. And when he said that to me, we started sailing off to the left. And as we were, I could see off in the distance, there was this purple glow. And as we got closer and closer, I could see these pink intersecting lines, almost like a spider web. And where they met up, they glowed bright yellow. And as we got closer and closer, it just gave off immense love. And he told me, that's the fabric of humanity. And I said, "Can I go to it?" And he said, "No, it's not for you." And once he said that, we sailed off more to the left. And instantly, I was back in my body. And I woke up with the most severe headache I've ever had. I had lost 90% of my hearing. And I was frantic. I'd had a stroke, so my right arm wasn't working. I eventually located my phone and called my father-in-law across the street, and he was there immediately because I was just slurring my words. I wasn't making any sense,
Yeah.
And within about 15 minutes, my husband and kids showed up, and they took me to the hospital, and that began the 2 years of pure hell
Yeah.
where they sent me away. They told me, "Well, maybe your neck shifted." They took one scan, they didn't see anything, and they sent me home. And I kept going to the hospital, day after day saying something is wrong. And again, they would send me home, follow up with your neurologist. And I'd go to the neurologist and he'd say, "It's a migraine. It looks like a stroke. Take a bath, relax. They aren't dangerous. Quit coming to the hospital." And so we put up with this for about 2 years before we finally said enough. And we sold our home out there and moved back to Oklahoma City here. And within 2 weeks, I was in with a new neurologist who went and did the proper scans. And they found that I had had what's called a vertebral artery dissection, which means the artery in my neck leading up to
Mhm.
my brain actually it broke apart in two big places. There's a picture in the back of the book where two big chunks blew out of it.
Was that the thing that you heard?
That was it.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was all tied. I have a underlying genetic condition that causes aneurysms and stuff like that.
Lucky
And the
you.
doctors were aware. They knew this, and that's the main thing that causes vertebral artery dissections. And so I'm so thankful for the doctors here in Oklahoma City that listened and immediately got me in to diagnose and to treat me. So they saved my life.
Well, I mean, here you are sitting across from me 7 years later. or almost 7 years later. It doesn't seem like there was anything permanent, at least from the outside. Seeing you
Yeah.
use both your hands, you haven't slurred your speech,
Yeah. Yeah.
nothing like that. Do you have any residual effects from this?
Oh, it's mainly pain. I feel like I'm going to pass out half the time. And,
Really?
I still don't, I've never regained my hearing. So I still have my hearing aids,
Oh,
you
okay.
know. So, I mean, I'm in my early 40s and I still got some things going on, but I'm thankful for every day. And it was a hard journey. I mean, most of the book is just the struggle. That first 2 years was horrible. And after we got my initial diagnosis of exactly what had happened 2 years earlier, there was a point about a year later where I ended up back in the hospital. And we don't know if it tried to rip again or what in that artery, but I kind of had another episode like that. And I mean, my blood pressure was sitting 40 over 20.
Wow.
I was, in the neuro step down here at Integris, and they took good care of me. But at the same time, my husband and I started making funeral arrangements because I had said, I can't withstand much more of this. If this happens again, it will kill me for good.
Yeah.
And so we started just looking, Mom has a burial plot over here. I want this woman to be in my kids' lives, to be a strong female presence for them. And, just all the sad things you don't want to plan in your 40s.
Sure.
But out of that, John said, well, let's do something positive. What do you want to do? What's on the bucket list? And I said, well, I want to go to Roswell. So my dear husband planned out a trip to Roswell. And we went that year, is 2019. We went out there for the big festival they have every year, in July. And we took the kids out there, and it was kind of solemn because the kids knew it was kind of a bucket list trip and still wasn't doing great, but it was fun. And I got to meet a lot of incredible people, a lot of the researchers. I was amazed. They were out there at their tables and you could just walk up and talk to these amazing researchers, And one of the last people I talked to there was Kathleen Martin. And she is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, are you familiar with the
very
case?
familiar with that case.
Yes, a huge case from up in New England back in the 60s. And I mean, they have some of the most incredible evidence and everything. They were really some of the first abductees to come forward. And especially in such a time when there was still division racially.
Oh, yeah.
And they were an interracial couple. And it took them incredible courage. I mean, to come forward with that kind of ridicule possible just for their relationship, and then to come say, we've been abducted by aliens on top of that, but they produced some incredible evidence with the star map that Betty had and the dress. I know Kathleen still has the dress, and they've run all kinds of analysis on it, on that pink powder that they found there. But Kathleen, she was incredible. I was so excited to talk to her. And she actually started the experiencer resource team for MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network. And so that got me thinking. Well, on our way home, we were riding in the car and I said, hey, John, maybe we can go to the meetings for MUFON and see if they have them in Oklahoma. I'd love to sit in and hear what they talk about. I had always been interested in UFOs. And it was almost like I had this freedom to explore that now.
Yeah.
And so we did. We called headquarters and I talked to the director of investigations at the time. His name was Doug Wilson. And he sat on the phone for almost 3 hours with me. It's like 2.5 hours and explained the whole process. He was so patient. And this guy is like number 2 in the organization, And he said, well, we don't have meetings in Oklahoma right now. Our chapter's kind of gone defunct there after some health concerns with the previous state director. But if you'd like to investigate, we can get you set up. And I said, I can do that? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, I'm kind of passing out every time, every once in a while. It's still not in best health. And he said, well, most of it's online. If you really want to do it, we'll give you what you can handle. And I said, fantastic. Let's do it. And I signed up, and within a couple of months, I was a field investigator. And by that next year, I was state director. And then within a couple of years, I became the Dean of MUFON University. And I mean, it has just not stopped expanding since then. I've really just kind of jumped in with both feet.
The bucket's got a lot deeper after that trip now, hasn't it?
It did.
So Jumping back for 1 minute.
Go ahead.
I'm curious about during your near-death experience. You said this being was behind you,
Uh-huh.
but you could tell it registered as male to you.
Yes.
How?
It was just the male energy that it gave off.
Okay.
I don't know. It was very definitely male to me.
Okay.
But like I said, it wasn't an angel. It wasn't human necessarily. I couldn't identify what it was besides being male.
Okay.
And whenever he spoke to me, it was more just instant thought within my mind. It was almost like the thought came from me, but I knew it didn't originate from me. And so it wasn't necessarily that he spoke in a male voice, but it was a definite male presence. I mean, you think if you were laying on the couch and someone walked in the room, you can kind of get a sense of who's walking in the room.
Definitely.
And that was exactly the sense that I got.
I know it seems like a small detail to hone in on.
Yeah.
So especially we were talking about it 10 minutes ago. But it was one of those things where, so I'm just trying to imagine this realm that you're existing in. Then you have this thing. Do you have any other description? Was it sound? Was it speaking to you? Or was it coming from inside your head?
Yeah,
or what you
I didn't even have a head.
Exactly.
And one of the things there, and I describe it in detail in the book, was that without that human container, without being housed in that flesh, it was like every emotion just encompassed me. It was laid bare and it was so raw. It was bigger than any emotion that I had had on this planet. To be over there, it was all unboxed and it was like I could examine every bit of me.
And that was my next question is, because of this, did you recognize yourself still as human? Or, I mean, obviously you had your identity as in, you knew your husband and kids and all those were still intact.
Yeah.
But was there a part of you that felt, I don't know, no longer human when you were in that realm?
It's an interesting question. I've never examined it from that point of view. I still had very much human characteristics. I mean, I was praying for my husband and kids over there.
Right.
God be their comfort if they found me. So I was still very much connected to my human identity, but I knew that I was in a different form and I knew I was being held separate from everything else. So it wasn't like I got to join the universal consciousness or anything like that. I was held separate. And that's what was so horrible for me. I've heard people talk about the void before. It's commonly referred to as the void. I called it the dark abyss whenever I first came back. And it took me 2 years to even tell my husband because I was terrified. Here I'm married to a Southern Baptist minister and I'm telling him I had a near-death experience. And on top of that, I didn't go to heaven. How do you even begin to process that?
But you also didn't go to hell.
I did not. And that's, I did a podcast a couple weeks ago and someone had mentioned, well, God's not there in the void. That was not my experience of it at all. God was there. And in like the Tibetan Buddhist Book of the Dead, their tradition was that I was literally in nirvana.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the highest heaven. And that was more my impression of it. And that's why it was so terrifying because I was literally laid bare in front of God. You think of people that fell face first in front of angels in the Bible and started worshiping them. And they're like, get up, don't worship me.
Yeah.
They were terrified in their sight. Here I was in front of the creator of the universe, laid completely bare. Everything about me is exposed. I was terrified, but it wasn't because I was judged negatively or I was sent to hell or anything like that. God was there. I mean, God encompassed that area. So I don't subscribe to the idea that God's not in the void. God is the void. God was all in that place.
And did you register any sort of, you've used, obviously we're humans, we have binary perception,
yes.
But we only have a limited way of describing things.
Yes.
But you have said off to your left, this is what you saw that was described to you as the mass of humankind, or it's
the fabric of humanity.
The fabric of humanity. That's where you put it. Was there a spatial awareness of this? Was that close? Was it distant?
It was distant at first.
And what did it look like?
Well, and that's what I was saying. At first, all I could see was the purple glow of
Yeah.
it. And it looked like a nebula or a map of brain neurons. And something that's really incredible is since this experience, I have seen where people have compared a map of brain neurons to the cosmic web.
Yeah.
It's exactly what I saw. The colors are exactly what I saw. The structure of it is exactly what I saw. And it's amazing that it's replicated within the human brain and then also out on a large grand scale within the cosmos. That's exactly what I saw. So I don't know if I was outside of the cosmic web and I was viewing it from far distant. One of the interesting things about that place is that there was a progression of time, but time did not exist. So there was a progression of events, but everything existed there at the same time. So past, present, future, everything, I could feel it all around me, but there was still a sequence of events. I was still able to focus on something in front of me, but I could have a sense of everything around me in 360. And so it's hard to put it into human words, the experience of it, because there's things that we can identify as, like looking directly at something, but we can't, identify with being able to see around you at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing with the progression of time. One of the interesting things that the U.S. government did was back in the 80s, they had a study called the Gateway Process, the analysis and assessment of Gateway Process. Have you heard of this?
Yes, I have.
Okay. That's in Chapter 9.
Okay.
I identified very much with that because what they were tapping into and trying to contact entities over in the absolute is exactly what I went through with my near-death experience. I read that couple of years ago and I got my husband, I'm like, John, listen to this. This is exactly what I went through. So the US Army was literally replicating my near-death experience by doing hemisync technology where they would feed different frequencies into each side of the brain to try to synchronize the brain hemispheres in these soldiers and have them meditate to be able to send their consciousness over into other realms. And the highest realm was the absolute, outside of time, outside of construct. And they were trying to get in touch with entities over there to bring back information back here for intelligence purposes. And so that's exactly what they did. I mean, they replicated my near-death experience almost to a T.
See, and when you learn that these things have existed historically and that there are records of them, it doesn't surprise me at all that now they're coming out with all this new evidence of UFOs. People talk about that like all these things are going haywire, and they're like, "Oh, it's a red herring." Now they're letting us know that these are there. But to me, the strangest thing is how important that has been, how much of our culture it is, and basically governments come out and going, "Yeah, these things exist." And people have not responded to it in the way that I thought they would. I thought they would like lose their minds, but now it's almost like, well, if you're not hiding it from us, okay, cool. Move on. How in the UFO world or UAP is that now the nomenclature we're using
Either
correctly?
One.
All right.
We're still the Mutual UFO Network.
That's what I'm saying.
We haven't changed.
That's what I'm saying. What has the response been to these recent
hearings
revelations, hearings, whatever, any evidence?
Well,
basically admittance.
It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I was on a podcast and someone had asked me, well, what do you think whenever disclosure comes? What's going to happen? Are, people going to freak out? And I heard a lot, the economy is going to crash and this and that. And I think that's more of the older generation thinking. Because we saw back in the 30s with War of the Worlds and, Orson Welles and people freaked out, and then even into the 60s, the mindset was still that people would freak out. But now in 2023, look at our next generations. I mean, I'm Gen X. I've got kids that are Gen Z. They don't care.
Right.
Gen X, we were raised more with, there's probably something out there more than likely by the millennials. It was, there's got to be something. And Gen Z is over here like, who cares? We'd like to be able to buy a house. And
yeah, and that's my thing. I feel like there are so many more pressing matters with people right now that they're like, okay, other life in the cosmos, that's great. We'll get back to that when we figure out our grocery bills.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'm wondering is, was this a strategic, like, okay, we're just going to slide this in here while everyone's worried about, direct corporal things in their lives?
I think that it had to be orchestrated to some degree, because we saw Project Grudge back in, I think it was the 50s that it came out. And I mean, that was a concerted effort to discredit the UFO topic.
Right.
I mean, that was their main thing, their main objective. And they did a darn good job, because up until a few years ago, especially, places here like in the heartland, people would be like, are you kidding? You're talking about aliens and UFOs. And you talk to anybody, kind of older than us, they laugh at it still. But in the last couple of years, that has changed. And instead, we're getting all of these wonderful reports of people coming forward now and sharing things that happened back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and things that they were always scared to talk about. Mm-hmm. And these are some high-level people that are coming forward and sharing their stories now. And it's wonderful to see that release and people being able to speak about these things that they've hidden for so many years, for fear of ridicule or whatever.
Yeah, you're not wrong. There is, I think, kind of a wave that we've seen, especially, like you said, with the younger generations. There's a lot more emotional honesty, it seems, in this culture now.
Almost to a fault.
Yeah, exactly.
I love them for it.
It's like sharing too much, too far into your emotions. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, considering like where we've come from.
Exactly.
So it's like anything else. It's a pendulum swing. You go from people going, shut the hell up, aliens aren't real, you're fucking lunatic, you didn't have this experience, you're either lying or you're delusional, to now it's like, people are so receptive of everything that there's no skepticism, because it's like, no, this happened to you. If you said it happened to you, it did. And I feel like we're going to swing back and there's going to be some sort of happy medium, because I was a kid who was into this stuff. I grew up watching sightings. I had the Time Life, I forget what they were called, but they were the paranormal or supernatural books.
We still have those.
Yeah, the black ones.
Yes, we have the whole collection.
Yeah, exactly.
Come over sometime and look at them.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if those are still in a box somewhere in my dad's attic.
Oh, how cool.
But I grew up, and also I had a giant wheat field behind my house growing up. So it scared the absolute shit out of me. Like I'd come home at night, like every night, and we didn't have a fence in the back. So I would just like look out and look at the sky.
Waiting for something to pop out of there.
I was always terrified. Yeah. And especially, during the season, it would get tall and all the wind would hit something. And let's not pretend there weren't animals out there, but so you're reading about these little gray men that are about 5 feet tall. Well, it's about how tall this wheat was getting. So I was always just absolutely paranoid that something like that would come out. And then I grew up and became almost too skeptical. My pendulum swung the other way. I believed in everything. And then now as an adult, I ceased to believe in most things. I'm like, no, there's a rational explanation for this, a near-death experience. They talk about the light at the end of the tunnel. We had laser eye surgery about 15 years ago, and they pull off or separate your cornea. And what it looks like is an old tube TV where you turn it off and you remember pins it down.
Yeah.
And then when they connected it back, it like comes back. And I'm like, so that to me, this tunnel of light seems like something happening in our neural cortex with our optic nerve attaching or detaching during this thing. But then you provide this description that doesn't fit any of that.
Right.
But it almost sounds more like how I've heard certain people discuss dimethyltryptamine or DMT trips, which again, naturally kind of occurs in the brain. So I still don't know where to kind of fall on the spectrum. If I'm to believe that you are actually in this realm, or if this is just something that happens in the cosmos in our brain during what we experience as brain death.
Right.
Well,
and that's a good point. And that's what several people have argued in the past, is this brain death. One of the main arguments against that is the changes that we see in people. And in the book, a lot of my book refers back to Dr. Kenneth Ring, who wrote the Omega Project back in the 1980s, or I should say the early 90s. And he was a professor at University of Connecticut, and he did a whole battery of near-death experiencers, and he actually compared them to UFO experiencers. And this was something I found after I had started conducting UFO research and started talking to people, and these abductees sounded a heck of a lot like me. And so I said, if I'm seeing some connection here, someone smarter than me definitely has seen it in the past. And that's how I found Dr. Kenneth Ring. And he's become a very good friend of mine. And I heard from him today, and he's thrilled about the book. He just finished reading through it and everything. And I'm so grateful for all of his research. But some of the main things that he identified from his research was that there was an encounter-prone personality. And what he meant by that was that not everybody who dies and is resuscitated has a near-death experience. Why? Why are only some of these people coming back and talking about, being in the lap of Jesus or going to hell or any of this stuff? Majority of people, 90% or so, go to heaven. They have wonderful, illuminated experiences and nothing similar to mine. Mine's considered a distressing near-death experience, but it still had a positive element to it. But anyway, so there's the encounter-prone personality. And what he identified out of this was that these are people who have had some kind of trauma in their past, whether it be physical or mental trauma or whatever, and it has necessitated them to learn how to dissociate. And it has to be dissociation to a point of exclusion of their environment. So they're not just dissociating. I mean, they are placing their mind completely in a new place. And he differentiated this from people that were fantasy prone. So the people that have had near-death experiences, who have had abduction experiences, they weren't out making up stories and fighting dragons and stuff like that. These people aren't imaginative. These people had real encounters where they're connecting with a different realm, much like a psychic would connect with information and be able to bring that forward. Same thing with the encounter-prone personality. So that's kind of a starting point for people that have had abductions or near-death experiences. And then on the other side of that is the after effects that we see. And some of these aren't just mental after effects. I mean, we see people becoming more altruistic, more loving, more, about a gospel of oneness. I mean, I see value in all religions now. I'm not just Christian,
Right.
I see truth in all of them, and I honor all of them, and I honor the people that abide by them.
I had an experience. I won't go into it. It wasn't trauma related or anything like that.
Right.
But I did have an experience that shook me very deeply. And that was the first thing I did coming out. I mean, I'd gotten to the point where, again, I'd gone so deep into skepticism that, it was basically, if you can't perceive it through our binary senses, it's not real, which in its own is, if you really think deeply, it's like, well, you can't see the wind either. Well, but you can feel it. Okay. But anyway, my point was, whenever I came back from that was the thing that I came from, was I immediately went, and I was I would say almost anti-religious. I went immediately to the bookstore and picked up all sorts of holy texts and came and sat and read through them. And you mentioned oneness, but it's the same thing with the world's religious texts. If you get down to the nitty-gritty of all of them, ultimately at their core, there's a kernel where they're all saying essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's all about,
let's love each other.
That's exactly it. And this is why the fabric of humanity thing, it just sticks with me, because that was the other thing I realized. You can't do anything in here. This is an entropic system. You can't do anything that doesn't have some sort of effect on another. People commonly refer to this as the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
But once you actually get that drilled into your head, that every good thing that you do has repercussions and reverberates equally, maybe more so, maybe less so, because, the human mind, we're averse to negative experiences. So they tend to weigh more. Things like trauma, you tend to remember a lot more than, say, your 7th birthday party, even though it's the most exciting thing that happened to you that year. If you got hit by a car riding your bike, those memories are most likely going to be, more prevalent in your experience. But this oneness you mentioned, was it peaceful? Was it disconcerting?
From the fabric of humanity?
Yeah.
Oh God, it was wonderful.
Okay.
It
Because you
just
mentioned
gave off
uncertainty
immense
and
love. I wanted to be part of it. And I've thought about that, why I wasn't allowed to go to it. I think I wouldn't have come back if I went to it. But I think that I existed there already in the future. I'm already there. And I believe that it overlaps with our existence here. Um, every day when we're doing wonderful things and good things for each other, it's contributing to that love that's found there within the fabric of humanity. And I know that that sounds real woo-woo and fluffy and everything,
yeah.
but that was really my impression of it.
Well, let's jump back in the same direction. We stopped when you were talking about becoming a part of MUFON.
Right.
So tell me about the work that you've done there. And specifically, I know Oklahoma itself, Oklahoma City in particular, has kind of its own UFO organization that very few people know about, that I actually learned about on Hangar 1. That was a
MUFON show.
Yeah, I was about to say, it was all about MUFON and everything that they do. So I really learned kind of the depth of that organization through that, and also about the board. Can you talk about both?
Yeah. So I got involved with MUFON in 2019. And so we're going on 5 years now that I've been involved. And like I'd said before, I started off as being a field investigator. And MUFON is an all-volunteer organization. And we're worldwide. We have chapters in all 50 states. We have them across the globe, Israel, Brazil, Canada, I mean, just everywhere. We have an international chapter that manages all of those, and then the national here that kind of oversees the states. But if people want to get involved with MUFON, you just go join and become a member. I think it's $60 a year, so it's not too terrible. You get the MUFON Journal with that, and each month they send out reports of some of the best cases that have come in throughout the month, and has articles in there about things that are breaking in the news. And just covers, keeps you on top of everything within ufology. And so those are always good to have. So if you want to become an investigator, there is a process. You have to pass a background check.
I'm out.
So the background check is part of it. You have to purchase a manual from the online store and study it. That manual is good 1.5 inches thick. And it covers everything from MUFON policy, structure, whatever, into how to give, media appearances and do interviews and stuff. And then it gets into the good stuff of how to investigate UFOs. How do you investigate a crop circle? How do you investigate a mutilation or a landing site or an abduction? There are very strict protocols that you've got to follow so that you don't contaminate evidence, and that you do things in the proper order. So that manual covers the whole gamut of it. After you do the manual, you have to then go on and take the exam. And this isn't just some easy exam because we're all volunteer. It takes about 3 hours, 4 hours or so to complete it. And you have to make at least an 80%. And I've had several that have failed it the first time and have had to go back. So you get about 3 attempts before you have to wait. So it is a process. Once you pass the exam, they'll do the background check, and then you begin training. And that's where I come in. So this last year, I was appointed as Dean of MUFON University, and I'm the National Director of Training over all of the investigators to make sure that everyone's trained up to a good standard. And we had a MUFON University prior to this, but it was kind of on an old platform. It hadn't been touched in about 15 years. And so this last year, that's all we've been doing is revamping and getting new information in there that's up to date to teach people what to look for whenever we get in photos and videos that aren't, necessarily easily identifiable. So we'll go in and we'll teach them how to look at flight radar logs and to identify if there was an aircraft in the area that was transponding at the time. I know some aren't necessarily going to show up, but the great majority of them will. And we teach them how to identify just a common aircraft and the required navigation lights and stuff that will be found on those. We'll teach them how to identify satellites and the tracks of them in relation to where the sighting took place, meteor reports, and the list goes on and on. How do you identify a lens flare? Right. You would be amazed at how many people turn in pictures of lens flares or insects that they caught on their Ring doorbell cameras.
Right.
And even one interesting thing that I've seen on there with the Ring, I got one case here that there was a line of lights, and you're going to think Starlink, but this was on a Ring doorbell camera, and it kind of swept through in front of this man's Jeep, and he was like, "What is this?" Well, these security cams, they have different diodes in there. Some of them have up to 8 of them, and they're all in a line. And so sometimes whenever the night vision is triggered, you'll see the ranging beam under right conditions. And so you'll see these little lines, or you'll see these dots that are going through. And so there's all kinds of strange things that we learn to identify whenever new reports come in. So in doing that, we normally identify about 85% of the cases that come in, and we're able to pin it down pretty accurately to say, this is flight number such and such, and they were going from here to there, and this is the type of aircraft or whatever. We're able to give good details on what was seen and what was captured and explain why it might have looked anomalous, but wasn't truly. Now, when we get into the anomalous ones, that's when it gets really interesting. Those are typically going to be our Category 3 cases, which we follow the Vallée classification scale. Jacques Vallée is a famous ufologist, and he kind of set up, different criteria for each one. So Category 1 cases are where they just are a simple flyby. Category 2 are going to leave some kind of physical effect, and Category 3 are the all-out abductions and landings. And so most of the really strange ones we see are the Category 3, and there's not always necessarily good evidence. It's just, the story that the witness tells. And on that end, we have a experiencer resource team, which I spoke about earlier, which Kathleen Martin started. And whenever we have an abductee that comes to us that might be frightened or having trouble processing what they're going through, we'll refer them to the ERT. And this team is made up of medical professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, researchers of every stripe. And they're there to help, walk them through that. And they have a list of different support groups or things like that they can refer people to, and even hypnotherapists. Let me back up and say not refer, but we can give them a list of what they, could check into. We can tell them, hey, we know these people, look into stuff, but we cannot refer.
So it sounds like a lot of the people who do work for you are professionals who have some sort of background in these things that would be able to call something what it is, whether, it's a psychological phenomena or it's something like the Ring doorbell. Like,
Right.
I imagine you learn a lot about how not just society works with flight plans and things like that, but also technology. Like, who would have known that about the Ring doorbell?
I know.
So you just end up.
Well, and the Starlink satellites, we actually had to put a picture of it up on our page before you report a UFO, and it says, look, if you saw this line of lights, this is SpaceX. You don't need to report it. And we actually, out of that, created a rapid close system for our case management system, where if there's a SpaceX that, someone sends in a picture and we can identify that, yes, there was a launch there, then we can go ahead and rapid close it and just let them know, hey, this is SpaceX, and there's actually a website you can go to see when the next sighting of one will be in your area. And they're incredible to see. So if you've never seen one, or if anyone watching hasn't seen it, go to that website, just, do SpaceX tracker, and it will auto-locate to your location and tell you, hey, go out tomorrow at, 8 p.m. and they'll be flying over.
Yeah, to your point, if you didn't know what these things were, I mean, it is a line of lights that's pretty equidistant, moving at a rate of speed with no sound.
It would freak me out if I didn't know what I was looking at.
Exactly. If you don't know what it is, I was like, because that was my first thought was, oh God, no, those are satellites.
Yeah.
Because at some point it's like, no, they are perfectly spaced and they're moving together. If
normally
one of them
we get a report of a fleet, or a mothership. When they're first launched, people may not notice, or that whenever they're first launched, they come out together. So it looks like just one line.
Yeah.
And so people will report a mothership. But as they go around the globe and they come back around and everything, they start spacing out. And so if you see them at different periods between when they've been launched, you're going to see something looking totally different.
Okay.
So when they're first launched, they're going to be super bright. They're in low, Earth orbit when they're climbing up into it. they're going to look like one single line. And then, like I said, as they go, then you see that little dots in between. And then pretty soon it gets to where it's a couple of minutes between each satellite. So they can look extremely different depending on when they were launched and when you're seeing them, how close after that.
It also sounds like you have a lot of skeptics in your organization, which actually, I don't know, I think it behooves you. Because again, it's one thing if you have people who are inclined to believe in things. It's like, I don't know, seeing Jesus in a piece of toast or something. Like, your mind wants to fill in the gaps. Oh yeah, that is the Virgin Mary in that wood door. But when you come at it from people go, no, this is bullshit, or there is some sort of logical, rational explanation for this, then it seems that you have a lot more credence with your reports and evidence that does come out afterwards. You mentioned category 3 being abductions. And this is something that we talked about Betty and Barney Hill earlier, and that concept, and what was his name? Travis Walton? Yeah. Those always scared the absolute hell out of me. And the ones even worse than that are the ones in your house. Now, there was a documentary that came out about 5 years ago. I was not really familiar with this phenomenon, sleep paralysis.
Oh, yeah.
And these beings that show up whenever you see them in the documentary. And again, when I watched this thing, I was like, oh, I've done it now. Like, I've never had this in my life. But after watching this, I'm like, you're gonna have it. Now, I've experienced light sleep paralysis, but it's always when I'm like running a fever. And it's one of those where you're just kind of in this like standing in two circles. So you're neither awake nor asleep. It's pretty miserable. Fortunately, I've never seen a being in there. But whenever you take the account of these sleep paralysis, a lot of people refer to them as demons, and compare that to something like Whitley Strieber's Communion, where he talks about visitations. To me, it seems like an almost perfectly overlapping Venn diagram of, oh, these visitations, this is just a sleep paralysis phenomenon.
Yeah.
Like what's kind of your experience with that?
Some of them are.
Okay.
And we, in talking with the witnesses, will sometimes be able to identify, maybe you should be speaking to your physician. You know, this could be something like that. We can't diagnose you, but this does not line up with what we would expect out of an abduction scenario. Most abductions, we see body marks that are left behind. Implants sometimes, not as much anymore. I think they've changed the technology where they're not as easily detectable. But there are still body marks. We'll see, sometimes people will have crosses on them or bruises and just different things that we look for within those markings that are left behind. People have, it's not dreamlike. They have absolute recall of what happened to them. Most of them remember being taken aboard a craft. You're not going to have that with sleep paralysis. And I talk about in my book, I suffered with the phenomena of Hat Man all through my childhood, which is a shadow being. And some people think that that's some kind of extraterrestrial. And I won't even weigh in on that. I dealt with him for years. But abduction is very much different. One of the most incredible cases with abduction is actually something that happened to a very good friend of mine. She actually wrote the foreword for the book. Her name's Terry Ling Kill. And she spoke at this year's MUFON Symposium, which we had just a couple of weeks ago in Cincinnati. And she shared her story for the first time, like on a big stage. And I'm so proud of her. In her case, she had a medical condition with her stomach. She had Crohn's colitis and had a series of surgeries that had failed. She was in worse pain than ever. And she had sightings of UFOs before, and she had suspected an abduction prior to this. Well, after she had her surgeries, she was in incredible pain. She woke up one night to find a reptilian standing over her. Okay. This woman is Christian, of all Christians. I mean, she is by the book. And so this was the last thing she expected, was to see a reptilian creature standing over her. And he pulled out some kind of wand, which she explains as it looked like some kind of octopus tentacle or something. And he ended up putting this into her. And she said she could feel twisting around her intestines and everything, and a heat there. And she said she felt like something popped. And after that, it was over. She looked around, he was gone. And she thought, what the world just happened? This is crazy. And she was an investigator at the time, and she was still not completely convinced, like, what happened? And so she called Kathleen Martin, and Kathleen said, get a swab of it where it touched you now. And so she did. And we have a MUFON laboratory. So she got the swab, she sent it off to the MUFON lab. They did a whole series of analysis on it. And it ended up coming back as relating to a tegu lizard, South American lizard. It was some kind of mutated, I know it sounds incredible, right? I don't know if I would believe it if I didn't know Terry myself.
Sure.
But I mean, we have the alien DNA on record within MUFON now, proving her contact experience. And so these are the kinds of things that are left behind after true contact experience, and that we are able to collect when we go out in field investigations and meet up with these abductees and contactees. There's some incredible things that we find. There was one where there was a husband and wife out in Midwest City, right by Tinker Air Force Base, and they had a craft fly over them. They had multiple contact experiences. This craft ejected a black mist over them, and both of them ended up in the hospital with environmental pneumonia after this. We arrived and took a sample. There was actually a black substance left on their car after this happened, and it ended up coming back as severely degraded pond scum, which is very strange. You wouldn't expect to find it.
Yeah. And, it's like you mentioned, it's like, even if, again, there is some terrestrial explanation, like how the hell would a South American lizard
Well, and it wasn't
residue?
An exact match to it. It was the closest that they could find.
I see.
And the way that she described this reptilian before having any kind of DNA result was looking like that kind of a lizard. She explained the ring that was around the eyes and the coloring of it very much relates to that tegu lizard. But it was not a tegu lizard. It was a distant relative of it, some kind of mutated, only a certain percent of the DNA matched with it. That was the closest match they could find. And how strange that was a reptilian that she saw. And we have a reptilian type of DNA that was left behind.
See, a part of me wants to sign up and get involved in this, but I think the problem is if I go out and do these things and I find things that are truly defy categorization or explanation, then be right back where I was when I was like 8 years old, like looking, out in the wheat field behind my house, hoping little gray men don't come wandering through it.
Well, I mean, and these are the incredible cases. Like I said, 85% of them or so we're able to identify. They're prosaic, explanations.
But 15% is still a large percentage of things.
It is.
And then
it's a huge percentage.
Even smaller, let's say it's half of 1% involve lizard residue or degraded pond scum that
right.
Where does this shit come from?
Well, the pond scum, if you think of UFO sightings over lakes, rivers, oceans, sometimes they see them actually taking up water into the craft. And I'm wondering if maybe it's some type of a biofuel, which we've seen our own government has been using pond scum for biofuels. So it would make sense that maybe, either it was a government craft that was ejecting it from their own kind of biofuel system, or it was something truly anomalous. But we have no way of proving either way because there's nothing on flight radar that's, saying, hey, here we are.
That's my other question. You mentioned being nearby by Tinker. Whenever you do have flight plans, does that list military craft or just commercial?
For the most part, it's just commercial. We will see like the strato tankers a lot that'll be flying around here. And a lot of times they'll be running exercises with some of the smaller jets and stuff. And you'll also see them up around Enid sometimes. They'll fly flight patterns and stuff, and they will show up on the ADSB. Okay. So
do you guys have any sort of contact at, say, Tinker and Enid, Vance up there that will... You'd be like, you don't have to tell me what it is, but we just are wondering, did you guys have a craft in the air at this time?
Right.
Will they respond to queries like that, or is it neither confirm nor deny kind of situation?
I haven't contacted Tinker. I used to have a lot of friends out there. I have people that know people out there, and I've asked around about a few different things because there were some craft that were showing up around here, which are some of our new kind of stealth fighters and stuff. And I know that they were having them out at Tinker recently. And so those are things that we will check on. We kind of keep a tap on that kind of stuff because, if there's something top secret or something that they're not wanting to put out on a large scale,
right,
we still need to kind of know about it so that we can say, hey, this is more than likely on the military side. We can't prove it, but we kind of have an inkling here. Just to rule out what we can. And some of them we can't, and you might go ahead and close it as an unknown just because you don't have that proof. You don't have to be 100% to close it as an unknown, but, we try to gather as much information as we can.
And this isn't something you'd have an answer to, couldn't possibly, but I kind of wonder what the military attitude is towards misinformation, meaning things that you're not trying necessarily to be untrue about with these things, but they know. And they're like, that was us. But, it just kind of muddies the water on things that they're doing so they can keep shit under wraps.
There are so many different factions and things that we're seeing going on with the government right now, because I think that Congress is really putting forward a valiant effort to try to get the information out to the public. And one of the things that MUFON is doing, our executive director goes out quarterly and briefs Congress of what we're seeing. I mean, we're not going to share people's names or anything like that, but if we're seeing an uptick in a certain area or we're seeing more of one type of craft or something, they need to be aware because, we do still have human adversaries that could be invading our airspaces and stuff. So, there's still a very real component of national security. But then on the other hand, there are these others that we need to identify. And so, our executive director goes out there and briefs them. Before the first hearing where Senator Carson was up there, that first hearing that he held, a couple of years ago, MUFON was out there and briefed them. And a lot of the questions you saw came from MUFON, that the senators listened and they said, what about this? What about that? And then with the latest National Defense Authorization Act for 2023, MUFON was instrumental in the whistleblower protections that were entered in. And what we see out of that now is like David Grush coming forward. And I know some people are kind of iffy on him.
True.
I think that he followed the proper channels. He got permission to bring forward what he did. But a lot of what he brought forward is hearsay. So we don't know what he disclosed in the closed sessions afterwards, but he was supposed to be naming names and naming departments. And so hopefully with the next hearings, we'll be getting some more information. But I think it's a slow trickle. We're getting a little bit here and a little bit there. We saw that Mexico a couple days ago showed the alien bodies, which is still yet to be determined. I'd like to see scientists from around the world. They said that they would give them access to examine and to confirm what their scientists had seen. So we'll see if that actually comes through. But one of the people involved in that is known to, unfortunately, bring forward hoaxes. So we can't just latch on to anything as much as we want it to be true, There's a part of me, though, that loves like carny sideshow culture stuff, the Fiji mermaid. Yeah.
So there's a part of me that whether, that the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot stuff, whether any of that's true, I'm like, sometimes I like a good... a good, pulling
gaff
of the wool over the eyes. Yeah. If you can do it, and especially the longer you can do it, awesome. But at the same time, it does muddy the water.
It does.
And we can't really get down to, brass tacks about what's real and what isn't, as long as people are out there intentionally doing it. The alien autopsy thing's another great example of that. And that was popular in the early mid-90s.
Yeah.
And if you look at it,
I remember watching that video.
Yeah, exactly. Look at it. Come on,
wow,
give me a break.
What's on there?
Yeah. And it also seems like, government, especially at the higher levels, like it oscillates back and forth. And a lot of it has to do with high-ranking officials. To tie into Oklahoma City and MUFON and what we're talking about, International UFO Board, which was actually started here in OKC, one of their biggest claims to fame was actually Jimmy Carter. Giving his account to them about his own experience. And that was, like I said, I didn't even know that this existed. My understanding is you now have access to all of those old materials as well?
Yes, I do. And I'll tell you how that came about. There was a case that was reported to MUFON in 2021, and it came in from a gentleman, I think he was out like in Washington, and he said, hey, I used to go to a boarding school out there in eastern Oklahoma, and a whole group of us kids, we saw a UFO back in the 70s. Okay, so I thought, well, this was right around the time that the Ariel School documentary was coming out.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, well, here's another schoolyard encounter. Let me, take some time with this. So I contacted him, and there was a total of, I'm trying to think now, was it 17 or 18 different witnesses that were there at the time? And they spanned an age from 1-year-old all the way up to adult. And the school, it was located in Hartshorn, Oklahoma. Have you heard of this?
Uh-huh.
I had never heard of Hartshorn.
Yeah.
Lived here my entire life.
I wrote, the Oklahoman who I wrote for a dozen years used to cover everything. So there's all these little towns. So people mention some tiny town. I'm like, I have actually heard of it because I had to know where everything was in the state. Anyway, stupid aside.
How funny. Well, I'm glad you know where it is. Yes. You'll have to go visit them now. So Hartshorn, this place has just sprung into this huge, like 2-3 year investigation now. So I contacted the witness and that reported it. And the way that the school was set up there, it was called the Miracle Mountains Boarding School. And it was started by the Buchanan family, which they've signed a release, and it's okay to release their name. But they had like 11 kids. And so they had the schoolhouse where they lived. And then they had like sibling pairs and stuff that had come to stay at the boarding school with them. So there was only a total of 18 or so kids that lived there. Most of them were the Buchanans. And then there was the father and mother Buchanan. They were both deeply religious people. And then one teacher, and she was 18 years old at the time of the UFO sighting. So the kids had gone out after lunch, dinner, and went outside to play. And it was probably about 4:30 in the afternoon or so, and they start seeing this little oblong object hovering in the distance, and the kids start taking notice of it. And over the course of an hour or two, this thing starts coming closer and closer, and so they alert the adults inside, which the only ones home at the time was the Buchanan mother and the teacher. And they came out, and they're watching this thing, and eventually it came within feet of them. It's hovering over a group of trees right there on the property, within 100 feet or so of them. And they're looking up at this thing. They said it was maybe 60 feet off the ground.
Wow.
And completely silent, hovering. And it had multicolored lights going around the perimeter of it, just all around it. And the oldest boy, he started getting really freaked out. He was the Buchanan son. He was the oldest son of theirs. And he was an older teenager. He got scared, and so he went in and got his 30-30 and climbed up on top of the schoolhouse and aimed it at the UFO. And when he did this, the teacher said that it then turned up on its side, and it made a sound like a vacuum cleaner, and it shot off. And they said that it went and it landed about a mile and a half away on they still had that property. They had like 6,000, 8,000 acres or something out there. And it landed next to the sawmill on their property. And the kids were screaming. They were terrified. So they got the kids inside. And the teacher said that night that she was pulling kids out from under their beds. They were all scared. And so she had them sleep in the living room in front of the fireplace. And the oldest boy, he stood guard with his rifle throughout the night. And the kids were looking outside. They said that they saw shape-shifting entities out there, because the teacher was like, what do they look like? And they're like, we can't even describe them. They were terrified. And so the oldest boy started boarding up the windows and nailing the doors shut. And it was kind of like the Kentucky Goblin case, where there was a kind of a standoff all night. Mm-hmm. There was never a shot fired here, but they were terrified. They were standing guard with the guns, and they were ready. And sometime in the middle of the night, it went silent. And so she said that they finally slept. Well, the next morning they get up, they pack a sack lunch, and they go take a field trip. This is what the kids remember. We took a field trip, and they went up to the sawmill area to see if the UFO was still there, but it was gone. And they didn't see any signs of it. So they came back, and they were going to prepare lunch. So they go over to the outdoor frozen locker, and where they had all 2 sides of beef stored, and it was emptied. Okay. And this was a working ranch. They had cattle out there. But in this instance, the processed beef was stolen. And so they didn't know really what to think of this. In the days that followed, it was actually returned.
What?
It was. It was returned. And by this time, the Buchanan father had come home and he drug it all out in the middle of the field and burned it and said, we're not eating any of that crap. Didn't trust it at all.
Sure.
And so that's kind of what went down at Hartshorn. So out of that, doing my research, I came across Hayden Hughes. And I said, well, who is this Hayden Hughes? I was like you, International UFO Bureau here in Oklahoma City. Oh my gosh, I've got to get a hold of this guy.
Yeah.
And so I tried to find him, reached out, found out that he had passed away in 2017. And I was able to actually get a hold of his widow, Bonnie. And she was incredible. And she said, honey, Hayden wants you to have these. So she contacted a friend who had them in a storage locker and said, come get them. And that next morning, I went and picked up all of the International UFO Bureau.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And so, there's the Jimmy Carter report.
Yeah.
There's a handwritten letter from Warner von Braun speaking about UFOs. All kinds of correspondence that Hayden had with some really well-known people talking about UFOs, because he would write to them. He'd say, hey, what do you think about UFOs? And he, half the time people are like, I don't have any comment on that,
right.
And they'd send him a typed letter and, just try to push him out the door. But he handled some big cases, and he was out in Hartshorn is how I ended up finding him. There was an article from, I believe it was the McAllister Democrat back in the 70s. He had been out there. There was a woman named Alta Claire Morgan who had started taking reports there in the city. Her husband was the postmaster, and she had seen a UFO up close. And she was like, I'm telling you, people, these things are real. And I saw one. And so she started having sky watches at her house and taking reports from people. And so she was a huge help to Hayden about all the stuff that was happening in Hartshorn. And going out there just this last year, people are still seeing stuff out there.
Huh.
So, and it's funny. It's a mixture. Half the people are like, oh, that old UFO stuff's hogwash, They don't want to talk about it. There was one gentleman that was very helpful, and he introduced me to all kinds of witnesses, but he didn't believe in UFOs, and he didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you the people that have seen them. So
I respect that. I kind of come from that position. I'm like, I'm, like I said, I've become probably too skeptical for my own good.
Yeah.
But I'm glad these people exist. And so it seems like Hayden Hughes was almost like a precursor to, it was like one man MUFON back in the day.
He started it in 1957.
Mm-hmm.
MUFON came in 1969, right after Blue Book closed, because we said, well, someone's got to investigate it. And so at the time, it was kind of the Midwest UFO Network. And so there were kind of little sporadic chapters. And at the closing of Blue Book, as I think the Condon Report and everything just kind of sealed the deal. And they said, let's band together and do this nationwide and train up people to actually go out and investigate these things. Because there's been a lot of places that collect UFO reports, but they don't necessarily investigate.
Right.
And so MUFON is different in that we do have the investigators, and it's all citizen investigators. And the backgrounds of people is so diverse. I was an ICU nurse. We have several police officers that are investigators here in Oklahoma. We've have military people. We have teachers. I mean, you name it, we've got it. And everybody has something to bring to the table. I put it off for a couple of years because I had actually looked when the kids were real little, when they were toddlers. And I thought, oh, wouldn't that be fun? But I talked myself out of it because I thought, I'm a nurse. I probably can't bring too much, I'm not military or law enforcement. Everybody has something to offer. And it's great to see the diversity in beliefs, because we have people that will believe everything, and we have people that won't believe a darn thing, and we keep each other accountable.
Yeah.
And so it's really a great thing to see, to get all of these thoughts and personalities together. And in the middle of that lies the truth.
Absolutely. How much material did Hughes collect over the course of his lifetime?
There's probably, I picked up about 20 boxes of stuff.
That's kind of what I figured.
His main investigation was the Heaven's Gate investigation.
Yeah. What was the deal there? Because that seems very, a little off.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess that Marshall Applewhite, and if people don't know, Heaven's Gate was the cult that believed that there was a UFO following the comet Hale-Bopp. In 1997 is whenever they had their mass suicide out in California. Tragic. I mean, and they were all laid out together. They went in groups and did it in a wave of 3 to finally get to their completion. But Marshall Applewhite, he had taken a real shining to Hayden Hughes. Him and Bonnie Nettles was his partner, Applewhite's partner. And they were known by Bo and Peep, or he and she, the two. They had several different nicknames and everything. But they came in, and at the time, Hayden Hughes, his partner, was Brad Steiger. And so they would come in and talk with him and Brad, and they recorded it. So I have tape recordings of their interviews. I have lie detector tests that they took, which they passed. I have interviews with some of the cult members and stuff, and I'm working now. I need to get them digitized so I can actually listen to them. I have the original recruiting tape from Heaven's Gate. But Hayden met with them several times, and he had several weird run-ins with them.
So this was a correspondence while they were alive and operating.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize
One
that.
of the things that he writes about, there was a book that him and Brad Steiger published that was Inside Heaven's Gate. And it's kind of hard to come by now. But he talks about an instance where Applewhite told him, if you ever want to get a hold of us, you need to send out this thought code sequence in our direction. And I've been able to locate the thought code sequence, which I will not reveal because I don't know what would happen now. But Hayden seemed to believe that it really worked, because that evening he got a call from them. And this was 14 months since he had had any kind of contact with them. And yeah, they called him. Yeah.
That's wild.
And so he waited till the next day, and he called him again. He said that had to be a fluke. And he said within minutes they called him again. And he said, or they asked, can we meet up in person? And he gave them his home address. And he said within minutes, there were 2 men standing on his front porch.
Holy shit.
And he talks about instances where he turned around. It seems like they have disappeared. There were several strange things. And there was actually an article written, I believe, by a local guy that says, why Hayden Hughes was almost convinced. And even talking with his widow now, she was almost convinced to join them. They found some credibility in some of the things that they were able to do supernaturally that just didn't seem quite human.
Yeah, and I had heard this recently. I don't remember where, but someone had said that either the website or there's a phone number that's still in operation.
Yeah.
And if you call someone or email, someone will answer you.
Yeah, the website's still up.
Oh.
There were a couple of them that stayed behind for that purpose, to keep the website up, to keep it funded and everything. And there's some of the people that stayed behind, they felt like they missed the exit, but they are still 100% committed, and they're starting to hold meetings again. So, and I don't, it's interesting to talk about it, but I also don't want to throw a bunch of credibility behind something.
Sure.
Knowing where they have gone before with it, I don't want to lead people down a dark path to start looking into stuff like that, knowing that what they're capable of.
Right.
But it's still interesting to note that Hayden really was almost convinced with some of the things that he saw. So there was something a little bit off and a little bit different with them.
That's fantastic. Man, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of
We
all the
are.
stuff there is to
We
talk
are.
about. Well, again, I may take you up on your offer to learn some of your investigative.
Come join us.
Yeah, I was about to say your rubric, your regimen, and see if I'm up to snuff, and at least give it a go. Because I'd love, like I said, I feel like I've almost become too skeptical of things, so it would be fun to kind of delve back into the mystery and the unexplained again. And
you start talking to experiencers, and you hear it in their voice. You hear it in their concern and what they're going through and what they're trying to process. Yes, we do get people with mental illness. I'm sure of it. Mm-hmm. But there are some that are not, and that's the majority of them. That these people are having real experiences. They want real answers, and hopefully we can help them find just a little bit of those answers. and speaking with them and sharing our expertise with them and, using our lab and our resources to be able to help guide them through that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Well, as you can tell from this conversation, this has always been an area of fascination for me. So hopefully we'll come back and we can talk some more.
Absolutely. Well, when I come back, you'll be an investigator with me.
I was about to say, let's go do it. Let's go see some weird shit, shall we?
Yeah. Well, and if any listeners want to join, man, we need people here. One of the things, I know you're wanting to wrap up, but just let me plug this real quick. With all of the things coming out in the government now, there has been an influx in cases coming into our database. Our database now has over 140,000 cases in it. And that's just the ones since we have digitized. So, and we're doing a whole new step of stuff where we're adding in some of the old cases from NICAP and Newfork. They're teaming up with us and we're able to add that in. Some of the old libraries from old researchers, we're adding those in. We're going to have over 1 million cases for members to access within our database. So that's coming. And with that, we need investigators. So with the rise of cases here in Oklahoma, we get about 120 a year, and we've got about 3 investigators right now. So you guys are keeping us hopping. We need investigators.
Yeah, that's a rate of like 2 a week.
Yeah.
Sounds like there's plenty of work.
There is lots of work to do.
Do they just join? Everyone goes to the national site?
Yeah, national site, MUFON.com, MUFON, and go to join and get you a membership, buy the Field Investigator Manual and start studying.
See if you're up to snuff.
Yeah.
Okay, that's rad. All right. Well, we'll get a good start there.
Yeah.
And what's next for you? I mean, obviously you're touring with this book, and I know you've got a couple of projects you can't talk about yet.
Yeah.
But what is it that you're going to spend the rest of this year, early into next year, doing?
Well, I'm kind of working behind the scenes as the director of training. We're getting, our forms and stuff up to date. We just revised our main investigation form, and I know that's kind of boring stuff, but it's stuff that needed to happen.
Sure.
So we're looking at all aspects of the organization and just getting things updated and bringing it up to really current standards. And so that's where a lot of my efforts are lying right now. Once MUFON University is rolled out here in 2 weeks, I'll be on to that, and people will be seeing me around. So I'll be making a few appearances here and there.
I was about to say, it sounds like you have plenty to keep you busy, and plenty of stuff for people who are interested to get involved now. Now seems like the perfect time.
It is.
I mean, literally the government's admitting that these things are real.
Yep.
You
can be at the forefront of it.
We need the investigators here locally and nationwide. So now's the best time.
No time like the present.
Awesome. Thanks again for being here, Mindy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
Come back.